Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing my April books video, telling you about all the things that I read in April 2025. I say that just in case you're watching me from the future sometime. I wanted to film in front of some books today, but I am aware it makes the lighting a little weird. So I'm not sure whether I'll do this again. When I watch this back, I'm sure I'll curse myself. But let's get straight into it. So these two are my placeholders for 4 books that I read and discussed with some of you on Substack as part of my How to Read and Analyse a Novel course. So in April we got fully into the individual novels section of that course. So yeah, we talked about Enter Ghost by Isabella Hammad. I just love this book so much. One of my favourite books that's been published in the last few years for sure. So really enjoyed talking about that. We also talked about Train Dreams by Dennis Johnson, The DeLorean by Missouri Williams, and of course Telephone by Percival Everett as well. All of those I enjoyed as well. But anyway, I will leave a link to where you can find out more about that course down below. It is basically self-directed, so if you do want to kind of catch up in your own time or do it some other time, all those posts and chats and things will be there for you. Okay, I've just adjusted the lighting, hopefully that works a bit better. There is another reread in my list though, which is Housekeeping by Marilynne Robinson, which we did for book club in March. And I will talk about this one because it's been such a long time since I read and reviewed it. I actually couldn't find my original review of this one. I must have talked about it on YouTube at some point. I've certainly talked about it since in different capacities. Anyway, I've reread a lot of books this year as part of that course that I've been doing. I'm sure I did another reread for book club at some point as well. I reread The Greenlanders, of course, and I've just been really enjoying the rereads actually. Housekeeping, I must have read this almost 10 years ago during my undergrad, and whilst I do still really like this book, it surprised me actually. There were parts of it which I just didn't really recall at all. So for example, when I read Gilead a few years ago, I obviously, was familiar with Robinson based on this book, and I was like, how did the same person write these two books? They felt very different in my mind. Having gone back and reread Housekeeping, I can definitely see the through line a little bit more between the two books. So basically she wrote this in she released this in 1980, something like that, and then there was a quite long gap of decades before she then went and started the 4 books that make up the Gilead series. Anyway, so yeah, I can definitely see the similarities now. There are lots of biblical allusions in here, but certainly I was onto something because there's a real intensity to this book that really speaks to kind of a younger, more passionate version of Robinson. Anyway, let's talk about what this book is actually about. So it's narrated by Ruth. She and her sister are growing up in a town called Fingerbone in Idaho, amongst these mountains and lakes. We can kind of assume this is in the 50s, sort of around the same time as when Robinson would have been this age. And she's haphazardly cared for by a stream of women. So first her mother, but then her mother abandons her and her sister on her grandmother's porch. So then she's brought up by her grandmother for a time, then by a couple of elderly aunts, and then finally by Sylvie, her mother's sister, who is was a bit of a wayward daughter. She's known as a transient, which at the time would have been quite the scandal for the respectable ladies of the 50s. She makes her life just hopping onto trains basically and going from place to place. So Ruth, our narrator, really takes to Sylvie and tries to become like her, but her sister sort of repudiates them both and wants a more traditional life and a more traditional version of womanhood for herself, etc, etc. Mostly remembered this as quite a realistic coming-of-age tale. It opens with the sentence, "My name is Ruth. I grew up with my younger sister Lucille under the care of my grandmother, Mrs. Sylvia Foster, and when she died of her sisters-in-law, and when they fled, of her daughter Mrs. Sylvia Fisher." So it has this kind of matter-of-fact feel to it. I really had remembered that opening. And yeah, I'd remembered it as this kind of realistic coming-of-age tale that deals with the house, different sort of conceptions with regards to femininity and motherhood and housekeeping. And certainly parts of this book really do touch on that. But it is so much weirder and stranger than I remembered, and quite ambitious. Yes, I do have to wonder what on earth was going on for Robinson when she wrote this, because it feels full of, it feels like a very sad book to me. So I know that some readers don't get on with Ruth. She's got this quite detached, strange voice. The whole novel has this waterlogged feel to it because they live in this like cold, watery place. And so does Ruth's voice. And she almost feels like she's undercharacterized at points, I think. She feels like almost like a blank slate kind of character. But I read this as sort of indicative of her deep and lasting trauma of what happened to her, you know, not having that warm mother figure. And as we sort of push into the second half of the novel, we get these really sort of emotionally heightened scenes where the sentences themselves are quite hard to pass. And because we read it in book club, we got to look at them closely, which I really enjoyed doing. And I think this book really rewards that. Felt almost sort of ecstatic, but in the sad way, sort of in a spiritual way, and an iterative, and it starts to kind of move into a place where it's sort of blending biblical imagery with folkloric imagery, and it's really interesting, and this is the kind of thing that I love. I just know that not every reader would enjoy that kind of thing, but yes, I think it's a devastating portrait of an abandoned child, and yeah, a really interesting debut novel. I mean, the fact that it is a debut is insane, and yes, as a kind of like dark, strange fairy tale almost, I think it really works. For me, I can absolutely see why it's become a sort of modern classic. I think of it as a modern classic, and I think it's a book I will return to again. Okay, I finally finished Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. So The Book of the New Sun is a selection of 4 volumes that cover the same story. So you could read them as like one big book, basically. But they're split up into 4 volumes. They were published as such. And usually in like newer editions, you'll find publishers will tend to like group the first 2 and the second 2. So Shadow and Claw for the first 2, and Citadel and Autarch? No. Yes? Sword and Citadel. So yeah, this contains The Sword of the Lictor and Citadel of the Autarch. Those are the 2 volumes within it. Anyway, in case you missed my description of it last year, Gene Wolfe is known for his sort of elevated speculative fiction, writing in the sort of 70s and 80s into the 90s. Le Guin called him our Melville. He's not super well known sort of in the mainstream, but within the genre, he's kind of a big deal and well regarded, well renowned for writing. I mean, I would regard it these days as literary speculative fiction. I think at the time it would have just been very good speculative fiction, but the way these genres, definitions of them have changed over time. But yes, it's high quality speculative fiction, and obviously, and this is kind of considered his magnum opus. He wrote quite a lot. The Book of the New Sun is like considered his sort of most famous and best work. And I read the first 2 books last year. And yeah, so in the first 2 books we are introduced to Severian, who is our narrator and protagonist. So they're set in the far distant future. The sun is dying, hence the title. And, man has gone to space and come back and basically has forgotten all that sort of technological and scientific knowledge. So much so that sometimes it kind of feels like fantasy rather than science fiction, because on the one hand these characters are wearing sort of swords and capes again, because they have so much history to pick from. I suppose why wouldn't they pick those sort of accoutrements than something else? But also because sometimes they'll obviously encounter some kind of ancient piece of technology which seems like magic. So Severian is raised in a guild of torturers, which is what kind of amounts to the justice system at this time, and it is an unnerving childhood, as you can imagine. So that's kind of the first book. He shows a sign of mercy to one of the guild's clients, they call them, and is sent away to this faraway city called Thrax to live out his life in this sort of peripheral place as an executioner. And finally, by the time we get to the 3rd book, he has actually arrived. Took us a while to get there. The 2nd book is about his sort of journey there. He doesn't stay there long. I don't think that's a spoiler to say. So there are many things to like about these books. First of all, the atmosphere is really well done. I really think he's a master of world building in that respect. You really get a sense that this world is sort of weighed down by all these, thousands of years of human history and all these arcane customs which have been kind of distorted by the passage of time. Imagery is sort of vivid and evocative, and there's some lovely passages throughout. I do think he's kind of known in this book for using these obscure, archaic terms, which he sort of reuses for certain things in Severian's world. But this sort of thing I think is I think there's a level to which it kind of crosses a boundary sometimes into unhelpful obscurity, or which kind of gets in the way of the meaning or the effect of the book. But yeah, peering through Severian into this world, I can feel its depth. I can feel its kind of dimensions, and a lot of that is done at the sentence level. I think Wolfe is really good at that. And, you know, for the most part, I really enjoyed these books, to be honest. I enjoyed my time with them, apart from the 4th volume, which we'll get to in a minute. But, yeah, I feel like Wolfe is kind of surprising in ways that speculative fiction sometimes isn't, and it gets too tropey and predictable. Sorry, I didn't even mention that I've got the Folio Society copies of these, hence why it's so beautiful. And I put a couple of pictures of some of the illustrations that I like the best from this on my Substack post. But there's something missing for me with these ones. Yeah, so even though I admired them quite a lot and even enjoyed quite a lot of them, there's something that is not pushing them into the favourites category for some reason. So these novels are well known for kind of being a bit of a puzzle. You're supposed to kind of piece together things across the 4 books. And I think I wish I hadn't known this because, and unfortunately I'm telling it to you now, so you will go into the novels feeling, you know, knowing that. But because on the one hand, I think the mysterious aspect of the book, the way it sort of touches on the ineffable quality of life, is part of its power. So kind of trying to unlock that mystery is not very helpful. Also, I feel like the sort of broad strokes of the story are not that mysterious. I don't think there's any kind of major revelation at the end. I think maybe some of the little piecing together, some of the little clues will give you a fuller picture of what goes on, but it's not like, you know, you be working something out that a different reader might not. I don't know if it's perhaps to do with some of the like obscurity of Wolfe's prose, and so a lot of it is just about like working out what's going on. So it was kind of like both annoying when it tried to resolve any sort of minor mysteries by the end. Certainly I was not convinced by some of the way he kind of wraps up the plot, a couple of little things, because I kind of felt its strength was it's being mysterious, but at the same time I was like, I wanted some more mystery, like I did want some bigger revelation. So I think that kind of was annoying for me. But my main problem I think actually is Severian and his narration. First of all, he's a misogynist. If I didn't have other issues with the book, I wouldn't mind so much. But yeah, naked women throw themselves at him, even though he regards them as lesser. I'm sure there is some distance between Wolfe and Severian, but I don't think Wolfe allows himself enough room in the book to do that, because he tells a story retrospectively from a very specific point in time, when something very specific is about to happen. And the thing with Severian is that he can remember everything with absolute clarity, and sometimes even he will narrate something and in the moment that it was actually happening, he's also remembering something else. So yeah, this could have been an interesting conceit, but the actual effect it had for me was to like collapse some of that like depth you get from narrating retrospectively, so having that differentiation between like an older version of the character and a younger version of the character, and it sort of eliminates that sense of progression, because he sort of says that, you know, when I recall something, it's almost as if I'm reliving it. We don't get that sense of, yeah, the progression which his character's supposed to go on very well. It kind of is all flattened by this. And that progression, that arc is really important to the book. And yeah, it's supposed to be sort of an almost spiritual novel. Wolfe was a devout Catholic, and we never get into that register. Do you know what I mean? It's all kind of like a bit monotone almost. I think because of that weird narration style. So that was a little disappointing. It kind of feels flat, or like kind of frozen or static almost. We don't get a sense of that like changing character. And on a more specific level, the final volume I thought was a big disappointment. I think they do incrementally get worse across the series, and the first one is still my favourite. Yeah, the way he wrapped up the story felt half-hearted, the pacing was all off, it almost slowed to complete stop, and then it sped up to way too quick. And whilst I understand that, you know, Wolfe wanted to incorporate some Christian ethics here, I do think if he hadn't, it would have been a more interesting book. I think he could have done something else with this storyline, or committed to it more. I feel like he's in some sort of weird in-between zone with it. I think on a contextual level, it's very interesting that he should choose to make Severian into this Christian or Christ-like figure, because Severian is to my mind, yeah, not a great guy. So why Wolfe would be sort of called to write this book, I don't know. I think in that respect it's very interesting. But anyway, I didn't hate the series by any means, and as I say, in fact, enjoyed quite a lot of it. Enjoyed being in Wolfe's world. I think it was the world that really saved it for me. But yeah, I think at a plot level, at a character level, it just didn't, it never quite got there. I mean, it's certainly there. Like, I think the man is a decent storyteller, don't get me wrong. But it just wasn't quite there for me. It wasn't at 100%. So, but I wouldn't rule out a reread for this and sort of see if I can glean some extra meaning. Maybe I did miss things. I might do that in the future. So that's a good sign, I think. And he did set some other books in this world. And also this quartet of novels has a coda novel called The Earth of the New Sun, which I think I will read next. Okay, I read a lot of Gene Wolfe in April because I also read Peace, which I believe he wrote before The Book of the New Sun, actually. It's a standalone novel that kind of reads like realism but is nonetheless sort of speculative horror. And yeah, when I was doing my research into his career last year, this came up as his sort of other great novel or most well-known novel. So I don't know how much to tell you about it because it's best to go into it relatively blind. However, one thing I do know about it is that I find it difficult to find a good reader for this book, a good fit for this book, so bear that in mind. So it's about an elderly man called Alden Dennis Weir, and yeah, he's woken one night to a tree falling outside his house, and this prompts him to start telling us this story. It's essentially the story of his life, but it's told in a very idiosyncratic way, like it's told out of order, and strange things seem to be happening that don't seem to make a lot of sense. It's all a little bit muddled up. Again, I don't know quite how much to tell you. I kind of knew the basics, maybe like one fact about this, which probably did help me a little bit more, especially in those earlier sections. But yes, something is going on here. So again, sometimes his prose sentence to sentence is kind of hard to parse and like work out exactly what's going on. But then at other times in this book, there's some really fantastic storytelling. In fact, there's a group of like 4 folklore-ish tales in the final volume of The Book of the New Sun, which I really loved. I think he's really good at that kind of thing. So like in here, for example, Weir tells us about folktales that he loved as a kid. He tells us at least one like horror story, like you would categorize it as horror. There's a whole chapter dedicated to his aunt and her many suitors, which I really enjoyed. Again, Weir is growing up in the early parts of the 20th century in the Midwest, I think. And yeah, so Wolfe has a really real talent for storytelling. Like he can write a really great story. There is a certain sort of unfinished quality to some of the stories, and the book as a whole, which I think is intentional for various reasons, but that doesn't mean it's any less unsatisfactory. So when I closed it, I was kind of a bit disgruntled. I had read it over quite a long period of time, which I don't think helped. But yeah, I was a bit like, oh, what was all that about then? But then I wrote up my notes and I went through it again, and I was like, actually, maybe there is more here to meet the eye. Because I was like, initially I felt like I sort of solved the mystery more or less, but I do think there is more here than meets the eye. And I do think a sort of more condensed reading would help. So I'm actually planning to reread it this summer. And I'm also planning to reread it with Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. And I think the two would make a lovely pairing. Because Dandelion Wine is also a coming-of-age tale of sorts about a boy growing up in the Midwest in the early parts of the 20th century. It's also fairly disjointed in style because it was it was originally like a group of short stories that kind of like then threaded together. It also has some weird speculative, unexpected elements to it. It also has has a horror story in it. And yeah, it toes that boundary between sort of literary realism and speculative, which I think is really interesting. Bradbury's novel is definitely warmer and more nostalgic, and yeah, this one, there's something sinister going on in this one for sure. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading them together. And yeah, before I forget too much, I'm going to go back and read it this summer, I think. I do think there's more in here that I could unlock. And I just want to see how I feel about it as a whole. Like, does it actually feel unfinished? Or was I just missing things the first time around? I also read Isabella Hammad's Recognising the Stranger on Palestine and Narrative in April. I almost made it like a full house for Isabella Hammad in April. I started The Prison, but I didn't finish it, so I will tell you about that in May's wrap-up. So the first half of this, so this is a non-fiction book. It was published last year. The first half of it is a transcript of a lecture that Hammad delivered. I think it's at like a Edward Said sort of event about his legacy at Columbia University 9 days before October 7th. And then it's published here with like a searing afterward, written in January 2024, looking at, the first 3 months of Israel's genocidal assault in Gaza and, what's changed since she delivered that lecture. Obviously, at the time that I'm speaking, the situation in Gaza has worsened. There's no aid getting in, there's a blockade currently in place, there's no aid, there's no food. I will leave links down below to some small things that we can do to help today. But yes, Gaza is very much on my thoughts at the moment. But yeah, as soon as I heard Hammad first mention this book, I knew I wanted to read it, because I'm very interested in narrative and narrativization, and how this interacts with politics, the stories that we tell ourselves and each other, and their sort of real world implications. And of course I was already very impressed with sort of how she handled a lot of that in Enter Ghost, so I knew I wanted to read this one. As expected, her ideas about narrative, and particularly about how it affects the Palestinian people, were astutely argued, very illuminating, and she's very erudite in that respect. And I think, it has relevance for the wider world, it has relevance for literature and for your ideas about narrative anyway, it has relevance for Palestine, and for her own work as well. If you're a fan of her work, it's interesting to hear her talk about sort of her relationship to narrative. And of course the second half is devastating. None of it will be news if you've been following it closely, but to see the two side by side is quite something. So yes, I highly recommend this one. I also read Raising Hare by Chloe Dalton. I got this one out the library, hence why I haven't got it now to show you. This was a very enjoyable memoir about a woman who ended up raising a hare during COVID. And before the world shut down, she lived this sort of fast-paced lifestyle, working as a political advisor and travelling all the time. And so the premise of the book is that the hare gives her a sense of rootedness and sort of changes her life and her outlook in many ways. First parts of the book were the very best bits, when she finds this abandoned leveret and takes it home, and I really could feel the tension of that balance between trying not to sort of interfere with nature too much, but also, keeping this hare alive, basically, without its mother. Despite the sort of premise of the book is definitely not really about Dalton at all. She definitely kind of maintains her privacy, and she talks in sort of more general terms about how the hare changed her outlook, and in lovely terms. But she writes the hare beautifully. I was there for the hare, really. You shouldn't expect loads of introspection here, loads of like a nuanced take on the issues and sort of solutions that we could find to live better with nature. She sort of touches on these things quite lightly. Usually this would annoy me. I'd want something with a bit more rigour to it. But actually with this, I just felt that she wanted to memorialise her time with this hare and this very unique and wonderful experience, and she writes about it beautifully. And that's that, it's not deeper than that. And I found, even though it was a very easy, light, quick read, I did feel a tear in my eye by the end of the book and sort of her concluding statements and saying goodbye to the hare. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a lovely read. For me, a great one to have out from the library, because I don't think I would have rushed out to purchase this, but I enjoyed my time with it nonetheless. I've got a few reading projects on the go at the moment. One of them, and I didn't read this whole volume in April, that would have been very impressive, but one of them is to read a saga, an Icelandic saga, a month. So this is the copy I'm reading from. It's actually got a preface by Jane Smiling, and it's a collection of some of them, but you can buy them separately as well. So obviously I've had success with a couple of novels, contemporary novels written in the style of Icelandic sagas this year. First, The Long Ships by Frans G. Bengtsson, and then rereading The Greenlanders by Jane Smiley. And so I decided to go back and read the originals. There's something about the style that does draw me. I have been enjoying sort of taking a break from, not taking a break, but just adding different narrative styles into my reading palette again, alongside more kind of contemporary literary realism and that kind of thing. So if you don't know, the Icelandic sagas are medieval literatures hailing from Scandinavia, obviously mostly about Iceland and Icelanders. I discovered there's actually like there's like different kinds of sagas that were all written at slightly different times, but these are the sort of most famous, I think. So yeah, they're medieval, but what makes them quite unique is that they're written in prose. They're not written in poetry. Yeah, this is completely different to basically every other medieval literature that you'll read. Also fairly unusually, they're about the lives of ordinary people. So farmers, soldiers, sometimes rich farmers for sure, powerful farmers, but fairly ordinary people. So I find them utterly compelling. There's something so strange about them because on the one hand they do feel kind of modern and contemporary. They feel akin to the modern novel in ways that sort of other literatures from that time period certainly don't. You know, they follow characters motivated by the same things that we are: greed, desire, jealousy, pride, and yeah, they feel recognisable and readable, very, very readable. But then you also realise that they're about a completely alien society in a completely alien world, and you know, where it's normal to be a Viking and go and raid other countries for booty in the summertime. Anyway, as I say, the plan is to read one of these a month. I started with Egil's Saga. I think it's well known to be like one of the best, which I don't know if that was a good place to start or not. But Egil and his family have this feud with the kings of Norway, and they move to Iceland, which is sort of fairly newly settled at the time. And we follow Egil basically as he travels back and forth between the countries, getting himself into more scrapes and issues and angering more folk. He's a pretty brutal man, but he's also a great poet, which kind of shows a different form of masculinity perhaps that we're sort of used to these days. There's some eye-poppingly violent scenes in here, sort of very vivid scenes. Yeah, it was a very engaging, kind of rollicking read. And I sort of liked, the thing about the sagas is the dialogue. That's where you're going to find some of that complexity, the feeling that there's like multiple meanings hidden in what the characters are saying. And I liked that sort of, when we did sort of stray into that territory of sort of moral ambiguity and getting to the point, like, do we admire Egil because he has his own very strong sense of sort of loyalty and morals, even as he's a very brutal man? And yeah, getting into some of those more ambiguous patches are really interesting, particularly because you just have no idea what the author really intended. So I think they're fascinating in that respect as well. So anyway, I think the next one I'm reading is the Saga of the People of Laxadal, which I'll be doing this month sometime, hopefully. I don't know where it's gone, but I did finish a volume of poetry by Naomi Shihab called Tender Spot, which is basically extracts from a few of her collections, like sort of her best poems from a few of her collections, compiled into one volume. And what I discovered from this is that I prefer like a collection of poetry conceived of as like one whole. I think I had a better connection to like Starr's poetry collection that I read before. I'm trying to read a poetry collection a month. I'm not quite managing monthly, but I'm managing something. I think I connected slightly more with that volume of poetry because it was like focused, and all the poems were from a particular period of her life and were sort of supposed to be set together. Whereas this one, whilst I did enjoy many of the poems and I marked down many favourites, I didn't have that same sense of kind of story across them, which I think is something I enjoy. Anyway, it's good for me to know that, but it doesn't mean the poems themselves or Shihab herself is not a great poet as well. So she has a beautiful way of sort of using everyday language with kind of a clarity that reveals some of the kind of seams of life, and also that takes the poem into sort of surprising places and surprising images, which I think is what all great poets do. They're easy to read, but they still have the effect of kind of making you sit and contemplate what she's just said afterwards. And yeah, I particularly loved pretty much all the poems relating to Palestine. Her father's relationship to it, her grandmother's relationship to it, her relationship to it. I don't think I mentioned that she's a Palestinian-American poet, by the way. But yeah, I linked some of my favourites in the Substack post if you are interested. You know, I'm not as well versed, pun, in poetry, so I'm mostly recommending based on vibes, but yeah, I would definitely recommend her work as well. So my final kind of reading project is to read more graphic novels, and ideally to read one once a month, but again, variable success with that nonetheless. We're reading more than I was, which is good. So this was based on a recommendation from Pran in book club. This is The Many Deaths of Laila Starr. I read this over a couple of hours when I was very fluey, very unwell, and I enjoyed my time with it. Some tears did escape my eyes by the end of it. I was sick, so I think I was a little more vulnerable than usual, but still. Yeah, I'm really interested in this art form. I'm interested in the ways that like kind of illustration and text interact. I'm looking for literary stuff, basically stuff that conforms to my current taste in novels and other literature. Like I'm looking for like complex stuff because I think this is the stuff that's harder to find, but I imagine that when you find a good graphic novel that does marry all these things with like complex theming and ideas and great writing, that it would be a very satisfying thing. So I think moving forward, I'm going to do some of the big hitters, like the big literary graphic novel hitters, like Persepolis and Fun Home, and then sort of expand from there as my knowledge of graphic novels grows. But anyway, back to Laila Starr. So this is kind of like a compendium of all the volumes as they were released by Boom, is it Boom Comics? So in this, death has just been fired. A child has been born who's going to invent immortality, so she is defunct, obsolete, and she's not happy about this, obviously, and she's sent down to Earth in a human body, again, not particularly happy about it, and there she comes into contact with the child that put her out of a job, basically, over the course of the various issues. And yeah, you can tell that so it's by Ram V, written by Ram V, illustrated by Filipe and Andrade. A woman called Inez Amaro helped with the colouring as well. And the colouring is really important here because it's very sort of gorgeously coloured actually throughout, but also the illustrations are fantastic. And yeah, you can tell the collaboration was a productive one, that you know, Andrade's illustrations really do support the sort of poignancy, the way he lays out the panels and stuff to really support the poignancy of the storyline, because over time, death realises what it is to be human, what it is to love, what it is to lose. And yes, but the story, I can't say I have thought about this that much since I finished it. So the story itself is nothing groundbreaking, it's a little trite, some might say. I think I'm probably more of a fan of Andrade's illustrations than I am the writing itself or the story itself. That's not to say it was bad by any means. It's not going to occur to me as like my favourite graphic novel, I imagine, in the future. So my library actually had a copy of this. So again, maybe a nice one to sort of dip into and see if you like it. But yes, I'm looking forward to reading more graphic novels. Finally, I do still have a British Library Tales of the Weird subscription. I've been trying to read this volume for such a long time. So they release these, Tales of the Weird, often a collection of stories, but sometimes a novel. Essentially stuff that's fairly sort of old and obscure from the British Library's archives, because of course they have access to basically everything ever published in the UK. And lots of sort of journals and things that we wouldn't be able to get hold of. So they're kind of reviving some of it in this Tales of the Weird, which covers things like the gothic, the uncanny, early horror, sci-fi, you know, the speculative of all kinds, and the weird, of course, like out and out weird. Yeah, I've been trying to get through this volume, which is a collection of historical weird stories, for months and months and months. To be honest, they were mostly very not good. And I won't lie, I did actually skip a few of these because, yeah, they were boring. That's like the worst thing you can say about a weird tale, I think. I do think the editor's own stories, so it's edited by Aaron Worth, and he put a couple of his own stories in here, were probably some of the best, and I don't know whether to blame him for the other stories and putting them in this volume, or whether to thank him for at least putting a couple of decent ones in there. If you're interested in Tales of the Weird, I can safely tell you that Out of the Past is one you can skip. It is not necessary in your life. I will try another one of those soon, but I am slightly burnt by that experience. Anyway, my loves, that is everything. Thank you so much for watching today. There's going to be some great books in next month's roundup as well. Book club wise, by the way, we are doing A Passage North by Anouk Arupragazam for book club in May, and in June we are doing Beware of Pity by Stefan Zweig, if you would like to join us for either of those. And there's loads of other details, I'll leave it all down below for you to have a browse of what's coming up in book club over the next few months. Yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Bye!